If you work parole in this city long enough, you stop believing in rehabilitation and start placing bets on how fast your guys will violate their release. I had $20 riding on Marcus getting busted for stealing catalytic converters before the end of the month. So when homicide called to say my petty thief had just meticulously carved up an alderman in a motel room, I didn't just lose my $20. I realized someone was taking my small-time crooks and upgrading them into monsters. The air in my office always tastes like stale coffee and industrial floor wax. It's the distinct flavor of institutional failure. I was staring at the clock, waiting for the minute hand to hit 5 so I could go home, pour 3 fingers of cheap bourbon, and wait for the ringing in my ears to stop. Marcus was supposed to check in at 3. He never showed. He was a twitchy kid, 22, string bean frame, severe asthma. He boosted car parts because he was too damn terrified to hold a gun. Every time I drug tested him, his hands shook so hard he'd almost dropped the plastic cup. He apologized to the furniture when he bumped into it. That's the guy I was mandated to monitor. A bottom feeder. A statistic waiting to happen. When my desk phone rang at 4:48 p.m., Detective Miller didn't even say hello. He just rattled off an address for a rusted-out motel on the edge of the 9th District and told me to bring a strong stomach. The crime scene tape was already up by the time I pulled my sedan onto the cracked asphalt. Flashing red and blue lights bounced off the peeling stucco walls. I flashed my badge at the uniform blocking the door of room 114. The kid moved aside, swallowing hard, his face the color of old chalk. The heat inside the room hit me like a physical blow. Someone had cranked the thermostat all the way up. The air was thick, heavy, and sweet. Copper and voided bowels. Alderman Vance was strapped to a cheap laminate chair in the center of the room. I won't give you the exact geometry of what was done to him, but it wasn't a frenzy. It was architecture. Symmetrical, surgical cuts. A brutal, calculated autopsy performed on a man who had been very much awake for the first hour of it. There was absolutely no way Marcus did this. Marcus cried when a stray dog barked at him. But there he was, sitting on the edge of a stained floral mattress, perfectly still. He was drenched in the alderman's blood, the dark red soaking through his cheap gray hoodie, matting his hair to his forehead. He wasn't crying. He wasn't having an asthma attack. I stepped over a dark, coagulating puddle to get closer to him. Miller was barking questions from the corner of the room, demanding a motive, a weapon, an accomplice. Marcus wasn't blinking. His pupils were blown wide, consuming the irises until his eyes looked like 2 black, empty coins. I crouched down to eye level. I expected the kid to snap out of shock, to recognize my face, to start hyperventilating and begging for a lawyer. I expected him to scream that he was framed. Instead, Marcus slowly lifted his right index finger. He brought it down against his blood-soaked thigh. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm, a metronome keeping perfect time in a slaughterhouse. He leaned forward. The overwhelming stench of fresh blood radiated off his skin. His face was completely slack, devoid of any human emotion, as he looked straight through me and whispered 3 flat words. The slate clears. My stomach dropped. Hot bile flooded the back of my throat. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the carpet, nearly slipping in the wet slick on the floor. I didn't care about the dead alderman. In that fraction of a second, I didn't even care about Marcus. I cared about the rhythm. Because exactly 3 days ago, another parolee of mine, a teenage shoplifter named Elias, had sat in my office across from my desk. He had stared blankly at the wall, tapping that exact same rhythm on my wood veneered desk. Tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. And right before he walked out the door, Elias had muttered those exact same 3 words. Both Marcus and Elias had just completed their court-mandated 6-week behavioral evaluations at the state's new flagship psychiatric clinic, and Elias was scheduled to check in tomorrow afternoon. I spent my entire drive to work figuring out how heavy a standard-issue tape dispenser is, and whether I could cave a kid's skull in with it before he managed to open my throat. They teach you in the academy to never turn your back on a violent offender. They don't tell you what to do when the kid caught stealing Xbox games suddenly looks at you like you're meat on a hook. Elias sat across from me at 3:15 p.m. sharp. Usually he was a vibrating mess of nervous energy. picking at the scabs on his arms, his leg bouncing hard enough to rattle the floorboards. Today, he was a statue. His spine didn't touch the back of the plastic chair. His hands were folded perfectly in his lap, the knuckles white and bloodless. He hadn't blinked in 2 solid minutes. The silence in my office was suffocating. The buzzing of the fluorescent overhead light sounded like a dentist's drill chewing through bone. "How was the Oak Haven clinic, Elias?" I asked. I kept my voice perfectly flat. My right hand rested casually on the desk, inches from the heavy metal tape dispenser. "Restorative," he said. The words sounded alien in his mouth. Too polished. Too many syllables for a high school dropout who usually communicated in grunts and defensive shrugs. His vocal cords lacked any inflection. He sounded like a bad automated phone system. "Dr. Thorne treat you well?" I pushed, watching his face for a twitch, a frown, anything human. Dr. Thorne helped me find clarity. He wasn't looking at my eyes. He was staring directly at the hollow of my throat, right where my pulse was hammering against my collarbone. His gaze was incredibly heavy, mapping the veins under my skin. I slid his release papers across the desk just to get him out of the room. When he stood up, there was no slouch. He turned on his heel with military precision and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. I didn't breathe until the latch clicked. I practically threw myself out of my chair, twisted the deadbolt, and yanked the blinds down over the glass partition. My shirt was clinging to my back, soaked in cold sweat. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice trying to get them back in my pocket. Something was severely, fundamentally wrong. I sat back down, dragged my keyboard closer, and pulled up the State Department of Corrections database. I wasn't supposed to have access to Oak Haven's internal medical servers, but Greg Frummett owed me his life for a DUI I made disappear from the system last year. I typed in his admin credentials. The progress bar crawled across the screen, mocking me. I pulled Marcus's file first, then Elias's. I bypassed the summary reports and dug straight into the raw, unredacted therapy transcripts from their final sessions with Dr. Julian Thorne. I hit print, grabbed a yellow highlighter, and laid the thick stacks of paper side by side on my desk. I started reading, scanning the blocks of text. Page 1 was standard cognitive behavioral garbage, coping mechanisms, breathing exercises. Page 2, more of the same. But the last 3 pages of both transcripts, they weren't therapy. They were identical, word for word, keystroke for keystroke. Thorne, the static is loud today. Patient, the static hurts. Thorne, we can turn the static off. We can find the source of the noise and we can excise it. Do you feel the metronome? Patient, yes. My lungs felt tight, like someone had wrapped a leather belt around my chest. I ran the highlighter over the text, the neon yellow ink bleeding through the cheap government paper. The transcripts detailed a methodical rhythmic auditory trigger, a countdown, ending with the exact same phrase Marcus had whispered in that blood-soaked motel room. The slate clears. I tabbed back to the Oak Haven directory. There was a third file under Thorne's recently discharged list. A guy named Arthur Penolligan, a 50-year-old check forger with a bad hip. I clicked Arthur's name. His final transcript matched the others perfectly. He had been cleared by Thorne 48 hours ago. My mouth went completely dry. I opened the active monitoring system to pull up Arthur's GPS ankle bracelet. The digital map of the city loaded, a green dot blinking rhythmically against the gray grid. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath fogging the glass. The green dot wasn't across town. It wasn't at Arthur's registered halfway house. The dot was blinking exactly over the coordinates of the parole building. I stared at the screen, the acid churning violently in my stomach. Then, I heard it. Someone was quietly, methodically testing the handle of my locked office door. There's a unique kind of humiliation in realizing a hollow-core wooden door and a $10 deadbolt are the only things keeping you from becoming a chalk outline. The brass handle of my office door twisted slowly to the left. The internal mechanism caught against the lock with a heavy, metallic groan. Stop. Twist to the right. Clack. I didn't breathe. My right hand clamped down on the cast iron base of my desk tape dispenser. It weighed maybe 3 pounds. If I swung it hard enough, I could crack a skull, but I calculated the distance from my chair to the doorway. 7 feet, not enough runway to build momentum. I dropped my gaze to the gap beneath the door. 2 scuffed, oversized orthotic shoes broke the line of yellow light spilling from the hallway. 1 foot pointed straight, the other turned slightly inward. Arthur Penhaligon. His rotting hip gave him a dragging, asymmetrical gait. I braced my legs, waiting for the shoulder drop. The thunderous crack of 200 pounds of dead weight splintering the door frame. It never came. Instead, the frosted glass of my door darkened as Arthur pressed his forehead against the pane. "Mr. Davis?" A voice wheezed through the glass. It wasn't the dead, robotic drone Elias had used. It was wet, ragged, and utterly desperate. He sounded like a man drowning in his own lung fluid. "Arthur?" I kept my voice at a whisper, inching out from behind the desk. The tape dispenser gripped so tight my knuckles ached. I can't turn the static off," he sobbed. It was a pathetic, ugly sound. "He put a radio in my teeth, Mr. Davis. It's ticking. It's ticking so loud I can't hear my own thoughts." My thumb dug into the serrated metal edge of the tape dispenser. Arthur was fighting it. Whatever Thorne had planted in his subconscious, it was cracking under the weight of the old man's sheer, unadulterated panic. "Arthur." I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No." The sudden heavy thud of his fist hitting the glass made me flinch. "They'll take me back to Oakhaven. He's waiting there," he said. "He said the slate has to be wiped clean." "Who, Arthur? Who is the target?" A wet, gagging cough echoed in the hallway, followed by a heavy, wet slosh. Against every survival instinct pounded into me at the academy. I reached out, flipped the deadbolt, and cracked the door open an inch. The copper stench hit me instantly, thick and hot. Arthur was on his knees on the industrial linoleum. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a pair of heavy-duty trauma shears, the kind EMS used to cut through motorcycle boots. He had jammed the blunt steel edge deep into his left ear canal. Blackish red blood was pouring down the side of his neck, soaking the collar of his cheap beige windbreaker. He looked up at me. His right eye was twitching violently, tears cutting clean, pale tracks through the grease on his face. "I couldn't get the radio out," he gasped. "But I broke the speaker. I can't hear the metronome anymore." He dropped the bloody shears. They hit the floor with a dull, heavy clatter. His shoulders slumped, and he smiled. A genuine, relieved, profoundly horrifying smile. Then, with completely steady hands, Arthur unzipped his windbreaker. Pinned to the inside lining of his jacket were dozens of glossy, high-resolution photographs. Surveillance shots, taken from a distance, probably with a telephoto lens. I dropped to my knees in the doorway, the breath violently leaving my lungs. The tape dispenser slipped from my grip, thudding against the floor. Every single photo was of my ex-wife, Sarah walking our golden retriever, Sarah getting into her Subaru, Sarah crouching on a sidewalk to tie the shoelaces of our 6-year-old son, Leo. Arthur reached into his blood-soaked pocket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy cream-colored Oakhaven stationery. He pressed it into my trembling hand. "Dr. Thorne says hello," Arthur whispered, and his eyes rolled back into his skull as he collapsed forward into the puddle of his own blood. They tell you panic is a sudden explosion, a jolt of adrenaline that triggers some primal instinct to fight or flee. That's Hollywood bullshit. Real panic is a paralytic. It's an ice bath that freezes the blood in your veins and locks your joints in place until you forget how to breathe. Arthur was bleeding out on my linoleum, his breathing reduced to a wet, bubbling rattle. My duty to care dictated I apply pressure to the wound, call an ambulance, and try to save his miserable life. I didn't even reach for my radio. My entire universe had shrunk to the folded square of cream-colored stationery in my trembling hand. The paper was incredibly thick, the kind of expensive cardstock that belongs in a law firm, not a parole office. It smelled faintly of sandalwood and clinical antiseptic. I peeled it open. The handwriting inside wasn't rushed or frantic. It was immaculate, sweeping cursive written in dark blue fountain pen ink. Officer Davis, you spend your days managing the symptoms of a diseased city, pretending your paperwork actually contains the rot. It doesn't. You process human garbage and lie to yourself that your hands are clean, but your ledger is unbalanced. I am simply offering a correction. We are going to cut out the tumor together. My eyes darted from the letter to the photos pinned inside Arthur's jacket. The glossy paper was already soaking up the blood pooling on the floor, the edges curling inward as the liquid seeped into the pulp. I reached out and ripped a photo loose from the fabric. It was a picture of my 6-year-old son, Leo, hanging upside down on the monkey bars at his elementary school. My thumb smeared a streak of Arthur's blood across Leo's smiling face. My stomach violently rebelled. I swallowed back a mouthful of hot, bitter acid, the taste of copper and bile burning the back of my throat. I brought the picture inches from my face, squinting under the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescence. The lighting, the long stretching shadows on the asphalt. This wasn't taken days ago. I checked the digital timestamp glowing in neon orange in the bottom right corner of the print. Today, 4:10 p.m. on, my brain misfired, struggling to force the cogs to turn. Arthur had been spiraling all afternoon, fighting the hypnotic trigger, mutilating his own ear just to drown out the noise in his head. He couldn't have taken this picture at 4 o'clock. He was already dragging his rotting hip toward my office to beg for his life. So who took the photo? I stared closer at the image, looking past my son. Behind the chain-link fence of the playground, out of focus but unmistakable, was a reflection caught in the side mirror of a parked minivan. A string bean frame, a cheap gray hoodie, a kid standing perfectly rigid, holding a digital camera. Elias didn't just leave my office at 3:15 to go home. He went straight to my son's school. Arthur was never the assassin. He was the distraction, the messenger pigeon sent to deliver the warning while the real weapon was already in position. My hands shook so violently I dropped the photo. It landed face up in the crimson puddle. I yanked my cell phone from my pocket, my thumb slipping twice on the glass screen before I managed to hit Sarah's speed dial. It rang once, twice. The sound of the dial tone felt like a physical drill against my eardrum. The line clicked open. Sarah, listen to me. Grab Leo and lock the doors right fucking. I stopped. The air in my lungs turned to ash. There was no street noise, no sound of Sarah cooking dinner. No cartoons playing in the background. Over the receiver, loud and incredibly sharp, came the sound of knuckles rapping against a solid wood surface. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. Tap. The static is very loud in this house, Mr. Davis, Elias whispered through the phone. But we're about to turn it off. I've never drawn my service weapon with the intention to kill. Even when a meth head buried a flathead screwdriver into my thigh back in 18, I put the bullet in his kneecap. Taking a life is a permanent stain, a specific kind of rot you carry in your bones. But standing in the doorway of my office, listening to the dead, rhythmic breathing of a teenage shoplifter on the other end of my cell phone, I didn't want to make an arrest. I wanted to empty a 15-round magazine into a kid's face. I didn't answer Elias. I just crushed the end call button, stepped over Arthur's twitching body and bolted. The drive from the precinct to Sarah's house in the suburbs takes 22 minutes in good traffic. I did it in 11. I blew through 4 red lights, the siren mounted on my dashboard screaming, my tires tearing chunks of rubber on the sharp turns. The AC was blasting, spitting stale ozone into my face, but my shirt was plastered to my ribs. My hands strangled the steering wheel. The leather cracked under my grip. Elias was a frail, asthmatic kid. A stiff breeze could knock him over. But Marcus was frail too, and he had dissected a 200-pound alderman like a high school biology frog. Thorne had carved out their fear, their hesitation, their humanity, and replaced it with a machine. You can't intimidate a machine. You can't negotiate with it. You just have to break it. I killed the siren and the headlights 3 blocks out. I let the sedan coast in neutral until it bumped against the curb, parked in the shadow of a massive oak tree. The neighborhood was sickeningly normal. Cicadas hummed in the bushes. Someone was running a load of laundry, the heavy, artificial scent of lavender dryer sheets clogging the humid evening air. Across the street, a sprinkler head ticked back and forth over a manicured lawn. Tick, tick, tick. Every sound was a metronome. It was driving me insane. I drew my Glock 19 from the hip holster. The cold, heavy steel grounded me. My thumb swiped the safety off. Sarah's house was a beige split level. The porch light was off. The front door was closed. I crept up the concrete driveway, keeping my center of gravity low, avoiding the third step on the porch because I remembered it creaked like a dying animal. I pressed my back against the vinyl siding next to the front window. I strained to hear a scream, a struggle, a broken dish. Nothing. Just the muted, chaotic noise of SpongeBob SquarePants playing on the living room TV. I gripped the brass door handle. It wasn't locked. It turned with a smooth, terrifying silence. I pushed the door open with the barrel of my gun, stepping into the foyer. The house smelled incredibly domestic. Garlic, butter, the sharp tang of tomato sauce simmering on the stove. My vision tunneled down to the edges of the hallway. The TV flickered blue light onto the carpet. I sliced the pie, moving inch by inch around the corner into the kitchen. My finger hovering over the trigger, ready to put a hollow point into Elias's chest the second I saw him. He was there. He was there, sitting at the butcher block kitchen island, still wearing that cheap gray hoodie. He wasn't holding a knife. He wasn't holding a gun. He was just sitting on a bar stool, his hands resting flat on the counter. I raised the Glock, lining up the iron sights with the center of his forehead. "Don't move a single muscle, Elias," I whispered, the words scraping against my dry throat. "Where's my son?" Elias didn't blink. He didn't even look at me. He kept his hollow gaze fixed straight ahead, staring at the woman sitting directly across from him. Sarah. She was perfectly unharmed. No blood, no restraints. She was wearing her favorite yellow cardigan, gently holding a glass of red wine. I lowered the gun a fraction of an inch, the overwhelming surge of relief making my knees weak. "Sarah, get away from him," I commanded, moving forward. "Where's Leo?" She didn't move. She slowly lowered the wine glass to the countertop. Then she raised her index finger. She brought her manicured nail down against the granite countertop. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. Tap, my boots locked to the floor. The air sucked completely out of the room. Sarah slowly turned her head toward me. Her pupils were blown massively wide, swallowing the hazel irises until her eyes were nothing but black, bottomless voids. Her face was completely slack. A terrifying, emotionless mask that didn't belong to the woman I married. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the hollow of my throat. "He's late, Elias," Sarah said. Her voice lacked any inflection. A dead, robotic drone perfectly matching the teenager sitting across from her. "Dr. Thorne said the slate was already supposed to be clean. You never really know how heavy a loaded gun is until you have to aim it at the mother of your child." My arms felt like they were packed with wet cement. The Glock 19 wobbled in my grip, the iron sights drifting from Elias's hollow chest to the center of Sarah's yellow cardigan. The kitchen still smelled incredibly warm. Garlic, butter, and simmering tomatoes. In the living room, SpongeBob let out a high-pitched, digitized laugh. The sheer, aggressively normal domesticity of the house was suffocating. It made the black, bottomless voids of Sarah's eyes look even more grotesque. My brain violently rejected what I was looking at, scrambling for a missing piece of logic. Sarah wasn't a criminal. She didn't have a parole officer. But then my memory snagged on a bitter phone call we had 3 months ago. She had been stressed about the custody arrangement, telling me she finally found a private therapist who took her insurance. A cognitive behavioral specialist, someone who was really helping her map out her emotional triggers using deep state relaxation. Thorne. That sick bastard didn't just randomly select my parolees to build a proxy army. He was building a cage around my entire life. Lock by lock, using the people I was supposed to protect. Sarah, listen to my voice, I pleaded. The desperation clawed at my throat, making my voice sound raw and pathetic. It's me. Fight it. Whatever he put in your head, it isn't real. She didn't blink. She just stared at my collarbone, her face a terrifying slack mask. The static is loud, she droned. I know it's loud. But you can fight it. Where is Leo, Sarah? Where is our boy? Elias finally moved. He didn't lunge at me. He simply reached across the butcher block island, his pale fingers brushing the wooden handle of a heavy 8-inch Wisthoff chef's knife resting next to a half-diced onion. He didn't pick the knife up. He just slowly rotated it on the granite counter until the handle was pointing directly at Sarah. Sarah stood up. Her movements weren't smooth. They were jerky, mechanical, and disjointed, like a marionette manipulated by someone who didn't quite understand human anatomy. Her bar stool scraped violently against the linoleum. "Sarah! Stop!" I yelled, stepping forward. I swung the barrel of the gun squarely at Elias's face. "Elias, I swear to God, you twitch again and I will blow a hole straight through your skull." Elias didn't react. He just laid his hands flat on the counter again and stared into the middle distance. Sarah reached out and wrapped her fingers around the handle of the chef's knife. She lifted it. The fluorescent overhead light caught the freshly sharpened steel. Without looking down, she brought the blade up close to her face and slowly, deliberately dragged her thumb across the razor-sharp edge. A thick line of crimson welled up instantly, spilling over her knuckles and dripping onto the pristine granite countertop. She didn't flinch. Her breathing didn't even hitch. It was as if her central nervous system had been completely disconnected from her brain. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She turned her body away from the kitchen, her bare feet pivoting toward the narrow hallway, toward the heavy, dead-bolted door that led down to the unfinished basement. "Dr. Thorne said the rot is genetic," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying that same dead, automated cadence. "You have to pull a weed up by the roots, otherwise the sickness just grows back." My blood turned to ice water. The gun felt entirely useless in my hands. She took a slow, dragging step toward the basement door, and from the other side of that thick wood, barely audible over the bubbling tomato sauce and the cartoons playing in the living room, I heard my 6-year-old son sobbing in the dark. "You spend your whole life conditioned to protect women and children, but nobody tells you what happens when those two instincts demand a violent head-on collision." I used to kiss the collarbone I was about to shatter. Sarah's hand was clamped around the chef's knife, bleeding freely from her sliced thumb. She took another mechanical, dragging step toward the basement door. I didn't think. I just opened my hand and let my service weapon drop. The Glock hit the linoleum with a heavy, sickening thud. "You can't shoot the woman who taught your son how to walk." I launched myself forward, hitting her square between the shoulder blades. We crashed hard into the hallway drywall. The framed photos of our vacations rattled and shattered on the floor, raining shards of cheap glass over our shoes. I pinned her against the plaster, wrapping my arms around hers, desperate to lock her wrists. But fighting a hypnotized person is like trying to wrestle a hydraulic press. There is no pain compliance, no hesitation, no self-preservation. She twisted her upper body with a loud, wet pop. I felt her shoulder dislocate right under my chest, but she didn't even gasp. She just drove the elbow of her good arm backward, catching me flush under the jaw. My teeth clicked together violently. Hot copper flooded my mouth. She thrashed, blindly swinging the 8-inch blade backward over her shoulder. The cold steel caught the meat of my left forearm. The skin parted instantly, hot blood rushing down to my wrist, soaking my leather watch band. I grunted, shifting my weight and sweeping her legs out from under her. We hit the floor in a tangle of limbs. I drove my knee into her injured shoulder, pinning her down to the floorboards. I pried her bloody fingers off the Wisthoff handle one by one. She fought back with an unnatural, rigid strength, her nails digging half-inch gouges into my bleeding arm. I finally wrenched the knife away and kicked it hard under the oven. I ripped the leather belt from my waist. My hands were slick with our mixed blood, fumbling with the brass buckle as I strapped her wrists to the heavy cast-iron leg of the kitchen island. She stopped struggling the exact second she was immobilized. She just laid her head against the linoleum, staring blankly at the ceiling, completely indifferent to her ruined shoulder. "Daddy, please let me out." Leah's voice cut through the heavy, iron-scented air. It was muffled behind the thick wood of the basement door. Raw, ragged, and terrified. I left Sarah tied to the island. I stumbled toward the door, my left arm hanging uselessly at my side, dripping dark red onto the rug. I fumbled with the deadbolt. My thumb smeared thick blood over the brass latch. I twisted the lock, yanked the heavy door open, and slammed my right hand onto the wall switch. The single bare bulb over the wooden stairs flickered to life, casting long, ugly shadows against the concrete walls. I expected to find my boy bound, gagged, or bleeding in the dark. I was ready to tear the house apart, ready to wrap him in my jacket and run him to a hospital. But Leo wasn't hurt. He was sitting calmly on the third step, wearing his faded Spider-Man pajamas. He wasn't crying. His round cheeks were completely dry. In his small lap rested Sarah's iPhone. He reached out with a tiny finger and tapped the cracked screen. The audio file of the screaming, sobbing child stopped playing. The basement fell into a suffocating, echoing silence. Leo tilted his head up toward me. His pupils were blown so massively wide they completely swallowed his bright blue irises. They were flat, empty voids. He didn't look at his bleeding father. He looked directly at the hollow of my throat. He raised his small hand and brought his palm down against his pajama-clad thigh. Tap. Pause. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap. Dr. Thorne said the trap needs bait, my 6-year-old whispered, his voice a perfect dead monotone. Close the door, Daddy. Before my brain could even process the words coming out of my son's mouth, I heard the heavy, metallic scrape of Elias picking up my discarded Glock from the kitchen floor right behind me. For 8 years, I convinced myself that shooting an unarmed man was just the ugly cost of doing business in a diseased city. You write the fake report, you wash the blood off your hands, and you go home to kiss your wife. You build a wall of bureaucratic bullshit to hide the monster you really are. But standing in my own basement, watching my 6-year-old son wait patiently for me to commit a cold-blooded execution, the wall didn't just crumble, it pulverized. The industrial floodlight hummed loudly, casting harsh, jagged shadows across the concrete. The smell was unbearable, a nauseating cocktail of old dust, my own spilled blood, and the sharp, sour ammonia of the meth head's sweat. He was thrashing against the heavy-duty zip ties securing him to the steel support column. The plastic dug so deeply into his raw wrists that his hands were turning a bruised, mottled purple. Through the silver duct tape plastered over his mouth, he was making pathetic, muffled squeals, like an animal caught in a snare. My left arm was entirely numb. Thick, dark blood from the knife wound slithered down my wrist, pattering softly onto the cement. I looked at the Glock in my right hand. The polymer grip was slick with my sweat. Then I looked at Leo. He was a statue in Spider-Man pajamas. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe heavily. He just watched me with those dead black voids, completely detached from the nightmare unfolding around him. If I didn't pull the trigger, the machine inside my boy's brain would send him marching upstairs to butcher his own mother. Thorne had built a flawless psychological checkmate. He was forcing me to either validate my own corruption by becoming the murderer he always believed me to be, or hold on to my fragile morality and watch my family slaughter each other. I swallowed hard, tasting stomach acid. I dragged my heavy boots across the floor, closing the distance to the steel column. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I don't know if I was talking to the junkie, to Leo, or to myself. I raised the gun. The barrel trembled wildly before I locked my elbow, pressing the cold steel muzzle directly between the meth head's wide, bloodshot eyes. His chest heaved violently. Tears cut tracks through the grease and grime on his hollow cheeks. I wrapped my finger around the trigger. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the harsh light. Trying to summon the callous, deadened cop I used to be when I forged that internal affairs report. Just 2 pounds of pressure. That's all it takes to buy my family's lives back. Just pull it. I tightened my grip, but as the slack left the trigger, the violent thrashing against the poles suddenly stopped. The frantic, muffled squeals behind the duct tape vanished. The basement plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. I opened my eyes. The meth head wasn't crying anymore. The sheer animal panic had completely evaporated from his gaunt face. His eyes, just like Elias's, just like Sarah's, just like my son's, were blown massively wide, the pupils swallowing the irises. He wasn't looking at the loaded gun pressed to his skull. He was staring directly at the hollow of my throat. He leaned his forehead aggressively into the hot gun barrel. And then, through the thick layers of silver tape, he began to rhythmically click his tongue against the roof of his mouth. Click, pause, click, pause, click, pause, click, pause, click. My stomach collapsed. The sound echoed off the damp concrete walls, amplifying until it felt like it was crawling inside my own ear canals. Elias stepped out of the shadows, moving into my peripheral vision. He reached out and clamped his pale hands tightly over my son's ears, completely blocking the noise from the boy. Dr. Thorne doesn't want you to execute the patient. Officer Davis, Elias droned, his voice carrying over the sickening, relentless clicking. He wants you to understand how easily the sickness spreads. The Glock slipped from my trembling fingers, clattering loudly onto the cement. I tried to cover my own ears, tried to stumble backward toward the stairs, but my legs wouldn't obey. A heavy, terrifying warmth started blooming at the base of my neck. The adrenaline that had been keeping me upright abruptly vanished, replaced by a smooth, dark, comfortable paralysis. My breathing slowed, my heartbeat synchronized with the clicking. I looked at the bleeding junkie strapped to the pole, and for the first time in 8 years, I didn't see a threat. I didn't see a victim. I just saw a filthy, ruined slate. And the static in my head was telling me exactly how to wipe it clean. There is no drug on earth as potent as the total surrender of your own free will. The moment you stop fighting the current and just let the dark water pull you under, the guilt vanishes. The wet, rhythmic clicking coming from behind the silver duct tape wasn't an assault anymore. It was a lullaby. My fingers didn't tremble when I reached down and picked the Glock off the cement. The black polymer grip didn't feel slick with my own blood. It felt warm. It felt like it was molded specifically to the shape of my hand. I stood up straight. The throbbing agony in my slashed forearm completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical numbness. I walked toward the steel support column. The meth head kept clicking against the roof of his mouth, his wide, empty eyes locked onto my throat. He was dutifully playing his part. He was the metronome. And I was the instrument. I didn't see a human being strapped to that pole. I saw the rot. I saw the falsified internal affairs report I signed 8 years ago. I saw the endless nights of cheap bourbon I drank to wash away the copper taste of my own corruption. The slate clears, I whispered. My voice didn't sound like me. It was perfectly flat, a dead mechanical drone echoing off the damp basement walls. I pressed the hot muzzle of the Glock directly against the bridge of the meth head's nose. I didn't close my eyes. I didn't hold my breath. I just pulled the trigger. The sound of a gunshot inside an enclosed concrete room is a physical violence. It felt like a railroad spike driven straight through my eardrums. The heavy hollow point round obliterated the back of his skull, spraying dark, wet matter across the yellow fiberglass insulation behind the column. The clicking stopped instantly, and the second it did, the warm, comforting paralysis in my brain shattered. Reality crashed back into the basement with the force of a collapsed lung. The overpowering stench of fresh blood, burnt gunpowder, and voided bowels hit the back of my throat, making me violently dry heave. I dropped the gun. It hit the cement with a heavy clatter. Elias collapsed onto his hands and knees, gasping for air. His string-bean shoulders heaved as a severe asthma attack seized his chest. He stared at the ruined corpse, tied to the pole, tears streaming down his pale face. completely unaware of how he got there. Upstairs, the rhythmic scraping against the kitchen island stopped, abruptly replaced by Sarah's raw, agonizing screams as the blinding pain of her dislocated shoulder finally registered. But the worst sound was right beside me. Leo wasn't a soldier anymore. He was curled into a tight ball on the cold floor, clutching his Spider-Man pajamas, shrieking in pure, unadulterated terror. He was looking at me. Not at the hollow of my throat. He was looking right into my eyes, looking at the monster holding the smoking gun. They remembered nothing. The hypnosis wiped them perfectly clean. I was the only one who retained the memory of what happened in this house. I was the only one left holding the bag. I sank to my knees, clutching my bleeding arm, the high-pitched ringing in my ears drowning out my son's sobbing. My cell phone buzzed in Elias's discarded gray hoodie. It vibrated against the concrete floor, a harsh, relentless spasm. I crawled over, my blood-soaked fingers smearing the cracked glass screen as I answered it, and pressed the speaker to my ear. "The tumor is excised, Officer Davis." Dr. Julian Thorne's voice floated through the receiver. It was smooth, cultured, and perfectly calm. "Your file is updated. You belong to Oakhaven now. I'll send you the names of your next 3 parolees by morning." Sitting in front of this microphone, hitting record, I process human garbage, but I don't build a wall of bureaucratic bullshit to pretend my hands are clean anymore. I'm just waiting for the minute hand to hit 5. I'm waiting to go back to a house that smells like bleach, to a wife who flinches when I walk into a room, and a son who won't look me in the eye. And I sit here, tapping my index finger against the wood veneer of my desk. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, just to make sure the static stays off.